Hi, I'm Tyra G, your host of Frankly Speaking with Tyra G. Welcome again to our virtual global gathering of phenomenal listeners. Yes, you, fearsome and generous, humble and honest, in pursuit of new possibilities and purpose. Now, you know, every week we meet for an hour to experience, educate, encourage, and empower each other. Through our joy and the lessons learned, we share topics that tradition tells us there's some things we just don't talk about. But not at this table. Here we live beyond the wreckage. Each week we start right where we are. You're listening to Radio Fairfax, Virginia, on your TV, computer, or mobile device, and we are webcast worldwide on the internet at www.radiofairfax.org every Saturday evening at 8 p.m. No worries, should you miss us, you get a second chance. Just go to YouTube. Key in Frankly Speaking with Tyra G. And if you like connecting with me offline, continue. I'm enjoying it. Email me at tyragarlington.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you, Courtney Nero, for composing and performing our Frankly Speaking theme song. You're awesome. Guess what, everybody? It's February. Shortest month of the year. And yet it's also the month that we celebrate Black history. Ever wonder how that happened? You know why it happened? Well, you know how I like to create a common thought space. Well, I'm doing one for the entire month, so I'm starting each show the same way. I want you to take a little walk back in history with me. For those of you who know all of this, just hum along with the music. And for those of you that are not sure, make it a gentle reminder, okay? Black History Month is an annual celebration of achievements by African Americans and a time for recognizing the central role of blacks in U.S. history. Guess what? It wasn't always like this. The event grew out of Negro History Week, the brainchild of noted historian Carter G. Woodson and other prominent African Americans. Since 1976, every U.S. president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. The story of Black History Month begins in 1915, half a century after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. That September, Harvard-trained historian Carter G. Woodson and the prominent minister Jesse E. Moreland founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, an organization dedicated to researching and promoting achievements of Black Americans and other peoples of African descent. Known today as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. The group sponsored a National History Week in 1926. They chose the second week of February to coincide with the birthdays of guess who? Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Did you know the NAACP was founded on February 12th in 1909? The centennial anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln? In the decades that followed, mayors of cities across the country began issuing proclamations recognizing Negro History Week. By the late 1960s, thanks to the civil rights movement, and a growing awareness of Black identity, Negro Week had evolved into Black History Month. President Gerald Ford officially recognized Black History Month in 1976. Each year, beginning February 1st, an entire month of events are planned nationwide, honoring the contributions of Americans. The theme for Black History Month in 2019 is Black Migrations, tracking the continuous movements of Blacks from the American South to the industrial North and beyond. Beginning in the early 20th century, a growing number of Black industrial leaders and Black entrepreneurs emerged as their families relocated from farms and cities, and from the South to the North, industrialized Northeast and Midwest. Along with the emergence of new music genres, the ragtime, blues, and jazz, the Harlem Renaissance in New York City also signaled a blossoming of the visual and literary arts. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem. Yes, it was known then as the Negro Movement. The movement also included the new African-American cultural expressions across the urban areas in the Northeast and Midwest U.S. Well into the century, Blacks continued to break the color barrier in sports, business, and politics, and have recently challenged the traditional bastions of health and wealth and power as the local, state, and national level. I think that gives us the right to lift every voice, and sing. Now, after a short break, we're going to enjoy 3 very short but entertaining stories, so you stay close. And we are back. I bet you figured out by now I love storytelling. I love to read. I love to listen to stories. And there is a wonderful show on National Public Radio called Tell Me More with hostess Michelle Martin. And this month, they too are celebrating Black History Month. So I downloaded 3 stories I think you will enjoy. So stay close and listen.
I'm Michelle Martin, and this is Tell Me More from NPR News. It's Black History Month, and this year we decided to acknowledge it by talking about a type of literature that has expanded our understanding of the experience of African Americans. We're talking about the memoir. Just about every day, it seems, a new memoir shows up on the bookstore shelf or in your e-reader, penned by the famous and not so famous. It's a phenomenon, as far as African Americans anyway, that dates as far back as the journals set down by former slaves. Now, though, there seems to be a new zeal to log family history or tell a compelling personal story. Every week this month, we will be digging into a new memoir or 2. But to get us started, we wanted to talk more about what a memoir is and what they're all about. We have called upon 3 distinguished writers and scholars of English and African American studies. They are Professor Dana Williams. She is chair of the Department of English and professor of African American literature at Howard University. Lorene Carey is senior lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also author of a memoir, Black Ice, and Professor Elizabeth Alexander. She is chair of the African American Studies Department at Yale University. She is also a poet who composed and read the poem Praise Song for the Day at President Barack Obama's inauguration. I welcome all of you. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for inviting us.
Professor Williams, I'm going to start with you. It may be a silly question, but is there a difference between memoir and autobiography? I think people are used to thinking of them interchangeably. Is there a difference?
I think it's actually a very good question. There is a slight distinction, and typically the autobiography is seen as the kind of lead or overarching genre, and then the memoir is a subgenre of the autobiography. I would say that the smallest distinction is probably that the memoir tends to focus on a small aspect of a person's life or the public figure or the public aspect of an institution or an organization. So it's still a life story, but it's probably a more abbreviated version.
Like a slice.
Yes.
A bit of a slice. Professor Alexander, I think we talked about the slave journals. Can you just tell us a little bit about what we know about why these folks were motivated to start telling their stories at a time when it could almost be dangerous to do so?
Well, if you think, for example, about Frederick Douglass, he was an astonishing orator, and part of his abolitionist mission was to go around the country and the world telling the story of his journey to freedom. Eventually, what his audiences and his sponsors realized is that if the book were written, if it were published, if it could be distributed, then it would reach far more people and thus serve the abolitionist cause even better. Well, as it turns out, Douglass was also an astonishing writer, a brilliant writer, someone who couldn't just tell a story, but also could tell it compellingly and beautifully. And so his 1845 narrative stands now as a work of literature that probably all of us have taught, and also a book that literally helped to end slavery. No small thing.
Lorene Carey, one of the reasons we're so glad to talk with you is that you have penned one, and you wrote one at a pretty young age. It was about your experience as a student at a New England boarding school, the first group of girls to attend this school, and you and I share that experience, oddly enough. So I wanted to ask, what made you want to write one?
I wanted to out that experience. You're talking to me, by the way, just a few months after I've been appointed to the School Reform Commission here in Philadelphia. And for me, going from public school to a boarding school in New England was an experience of going from an education where basically many of my teachers as I was growing up looked at us and tried to figure out what was wrong with us in order to try to fix us and get us better, to an experience where all of these people looked at us as if to try very hard to figure out what was special and exquisite about us. I felt the difference in those expectations, and it made me furious that we weren't talking honestly about them, and I wanted to out the experience.
Do you think you wrote it mainly for yourself, in a way, to kind of put it down and understand it for yourself? Or I'm wondering who you had in mind as you were writing that work, which was a bestseller, by the way.
I'll tell you, Michelle, the first draft is always for myself. The first draft, I think, needs to be for oneself. The first draft is mapping the landscape, your own internal landscape, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, physically. It's therapy, it's getting honest, it's getting the tone. Typically, I have to write 200 pages until I write my way to the door of the book. So a lot of it is throwaway, it's getting good enough, it's running laps. And then after that, truth is, I didn't expect anybody to read the book, to be honest. I just hoped that it would get enough readers. They published 7,500 the first edition. I just hoped for enough readers so that I could get a contract for the next one.
But it did a lot better than that.
It did a lot better than that.
So what do you think people saw in it? Because it's still an experience that not a lot of people will have had.
I think that the first level is often sociological. People come to this to find out what it was like to be a scholarship girl at a boarding school that had been all boys, all white, all male, all wealthy. But then I think in order for people to stay with it, the book has to reflect something true about the experience of learning and of growing up. That's what people get from it. So I get all these letters from people who say, I was not a black girl in boarding school, comma, but. And then they tell all of their own experiences. It is the experience of learning or of figuring out how to give gifts that one didn't receive, or of how to overcome challenges, or of how to be in a situation where people do not expect the best of you, but figuring out how to exceed those expectations anyway.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Tell Me More from NPR News. We're starting off Black History Month. This Black History Month, we decided to dig into memoirs that explore the African American experience. But we wanted to start off with talking with three distinguished writers and scholars who have either penned a memoir or studied memoir to talk about what role memoir plays in the African American experience. We're speaking with Lorene Carey, senior lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. That's who was speaking just now. She's author of the memoir Black Ice. Also with us, Professor Elizabeth Alexander, chair of the African American Studies Department at Yale University. She's also a poet, and you'll remember that she composed the poem Praise Song for the Day at President Barack Obama's inauguration. And Professor Dana Williams, chair of the Department of English at Howard University. Professor Williams, what's your take on why? I'm wondering if you share my perception that more people and a really wide array of people seem to be sharing their memoirs these days.
People, I think, are very interested not only in telling their stories for themselves, but having people see and understand the same thing, this coming into awareness and this coming into consciousness that they experience themselves. You can't pretend to know absolutely everything, but you can tell specifically the experience that you had and what you know and how it has impacted you, but also how it was shaped by the environment that you come out of and how it also shapes the environment as well.
Professor Alexander, have you seen, do memoirs seem to be arguing a case or something, or trying to, what have you seen over the course of all the hundreds of years that people have been writing these, particularly African Americans?
Well, I think in moving from the slave narratives, and I think we should put them at the beginning of thinking about African American autobiography and the kind of instrumentality of writing those books, you have other books moving forward that, because the person is someone of note, then in the literary world, that's a book that gets contracted. And what we have in the contemporary era, I think, is as Black lives, more kinds of Black lives have made their way into the mainstream imagination. I think, therefore, more people, and I'm thinking Condoleezza Rice. Do we talk about that as a literary memoir? Well, she came out with two books at about the same time, and the one that she wrote that was more about the Birmingham of her childhood, more about her coming of age, is a book that we read because she's someone whose name we know, and we think that we're going to get to go behind the veil, to use Du Bois's wonderful phrase. So I think more Black lives are publicly known now, and so maybe that's why more Black lives are making it into autobiographical form, even if these aren't the folks that we would necessarily think of as writers.
Well, that brings me back to, I'll just call him Memorist-in-Chief, President Barack Obama. People think of Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance, as something he wrote as he was preparing to run for president, but that's actually not true. He was initially offered the contract to chronicle being elected the first Black president of the Harvard Law Review. So he wrote that right after law school, or he at least started. And we happen to have a narration of him reading the book, for which he won a Grammy Award for Best Spoken Word. So let me just play a short clip from that. Here it is.
I know, I have seen, the desperation and disorder of the powerless, how it twists the lives of children on the streets of Jakarta or Nairobi in much the same way as it does the lives of children on Chicago's South Side. How narrow the path is for them between humiliation and untrammeled fury, how easily they slip into violence and despair. I know that the response of the powerful to this disorder, alternating as it does between a dull complacency and, when the disorder spills out of its prescribed confines, a steady, unthinking application of force, of longer prison sentences, and more sophisticated military hardware, is inadequate to the task.
How does each of you hear this? Professor Alexander, I'll start with you. And as we mentioned, you did write the poem for President Obama's inauguration, so you do have a relationship, friendship, But how do you read it? How do you hear it?
Well, I think it's a great memoir. It's a memoir that I've taught. It's a memoir that my colleague, the literary scholar Robert Steptoe, has written about. And what I think is so interesting about it is that it is an American coming-of-age story with literary ties to the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, to the Confessions of St. Augustine, to the autobiography of Malcolm X, even in a way to the sentimental women's novels of the 19th century, which end with "Reader, I married him." And here we see that marriage is what ends or almost ends the book. So he's coming of age, but he's also in the book narrating a coming of and into a complex Black identity. And that's what I particularly love about it, too, and what the recording of it lets us listen to when he goes in and out of all of the different voices of the characters who peopled his life growing up. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, finding himself also as he reads African American literature, thinking about who the self is with a literary education to guide the formation of that self. I think it's a fascinating book.
Lorene, how about you? How do you read it or hear it?
I hear it as a story. By the way, this is one of the few times I get to say this, that he and I shared an agent for this book. And I remember my agent saying, "This is amazing. You are going to hear more from this person. This is an amazing memoir." And what she said was, "It's a joy to read," because she was thinking about selling a book. So I heard it first as a book that was needing to tell a story and needing to tell a story in a way that's beautiful. By the way, our conversation here is very serious, and everybody's being called professor, and so we're being very, very intellectual and smart about this. But they should be fun to read. I mean, they should be.
Yes.
They should be. Sometimes they're funny. They should be laugh out loud. They should be move you.
I just
do
want
all
to tell
of
you,
these things.
I'm sorry, I just want to tell you, we got something for you. Next week, we will be joined by Baratunde Thurston to talk about his memoir, How to Be Black. And just to give you a sense of the tone of it, he says, if you don't buy this book, you're a racist. So I just want you to know that we heard you, we hear you, we will comply. Professor Williams, what do you, Lorene, had you finished your thought?
Sure.
Okay. Professor Williams, how do you read President Obama's memoir? Or maybe you're ready to move on and tell us what your favorite memoir is, because that's how we're going to end up. We're asking each of you what's your favorite memoir.
It's a really great book. I like it a lot. I think the thing that is most attractive to me is the effortlessness of the book. The prose flows so beautifully. So it's like we're saying, it's very easy to read. You're learning a lot at the same time, but you're also able to move through the narrative in a way that allows you to feel comfortable, and the language, the word choice, all beautiful.
And so what's your favorite? So this is a couple of minutes that we have left, and thank you all so much for taking the time to share with us about this. So Professor Williams, before we let you go, what's your favorite memoir? Do you have one?
Right now, I'm reading Harry Belafonte's My Song, and it's becoming my favorite. It's a beautiful book. It's well written, but it's also a very true and poignant story.
Okay.
So I like the way especially that he talks about how he moves through the world with the effort to be precise and dignified. And I think the book takes on those two characteristics as well.
Okay. Lorene, Carey, what about you? Do you have a favorite besides your own? Well, your own could be. You can pick your own. It's one of my favorites.
Well, I will tell you, it is, at the end of the day, when you write a book, really the only person who's been transformed is oneself. So it does impact you more. I love Frederick Douglass's narrative. I love it like I love my great-grandfather. It always stays with me.
Professor Alexander, final thought from you?
I love Audre Lorde's Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, a beautiful memoir which she calls a biomythography. And she talks about, I think it's wonderful the way that it says that telling the story of the self isn't always about empirical and verifiable truth. We know ourselves and understand our true selves in myth as much as we do in empirical fact. And she's a gorgeous poet and a gorgeous writer, and she plays around with the form, and it's a beautiful book.
Professor Elizabeth Alexander is chair of the African American Studies Department at Yale University. And as we mentioned, she's the poet who composed and read the poem Praise Song for the Day at the inauguration of President Barack Obama. And an illustrated children's version of that poem is being released next month with illustrations by David Diaz. And she was kind enough to join us from the studios at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Also with us, Lorene Carey. She is senior lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of many books, including her memoir, Black Ice. And Lorene Carey joined us from Philadelphia. And also with us, Professor Dana Williams. She is chair of the Department of English and professor of African American literature at Howard University, and she was kind enough to join us here in our Washington, D.C. studios. Ladies, professors all, thank you all so much. Happy Black History Month to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much, Michelle.
Next week, as we mentioned, we will be joined by Baratunde Thurston to review his memoir, How to Be Black. And that's our program for today. I'm Michelle Martin, and this is Tell Me More from NPR News. Let's talk more tomorrow. I'm Michelle Martin, and this is Tell Me More from NPR News. Today, we are going to bring you the last installment of our Black History Month series. All month long, we've been digging into some of the literature that has expanded our understanding of African American lives through personal stories, the memoir. African American memoirs date as far back as the journals set down by former slaves. But we notice that these days there seems to be a fresh zeal to tell a compelling personal story. And over the course of this past month, we have heard from a former Black Panther, a top journalist, a rising star in comedy, and 2 women essayists debating what it means to be cool. But for our final conversation, we decided to turn to a man whose life story captures so much of the African American experience in this country. We just had to conclude with him. Bertie Bowman is the author of Step by Step, a memoir of living the American dream. In the book, he describes how he made his way step by step from a poor farm in rural South Carolina to sweeping the steps of the Capitol building to becoming a staffer with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Among his duties there, he once supervised a hardworking, nice young man from Arkansas named Bill, whose last name happened to be Clinton, and who wound up living at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, and he'll tell us about that. Bertie Bowman is now 81, but he has no intention of slowing down. He's still working for the Foreign Relations Committee, but he took time out to join us in our Washington, D.C. studios. Bertie Bowman, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me. My name is Bertie H. Bowman, and I have enjoyed life very much.
Well, we want to hear more about that. The first thing, though, I've been asking all of our authors this month is, why did you decide to write a memoir, and why now?
Because people kept telling me to write the story. A lot of them did not believe what I was telling them just off the cuff. And my wife, Elaine, I dedicate the book to her. She now resting with the good Lord. She was involved in me writing this book.
Well, I can understand why people don't believe it, because it is an incredible story. You were born in Summerton, South Carolina. You were what? You were number 5 of 12 children. You mentioned that you didn't go hungry, but you knew it was a very hard life. And at some point, you decided you wanted something else for your life. And at 13 years old, you packed all your belongings into a flour sack, got on a train, and came to Washington, D.C. So the first thing I have to ask you is, why did you run away?
I was thinking about coming to Washington all the time because of the other kids that when they get out of high school, they usually either go to community college or leave for Philadelphia, New York, any place that think they can be different than being on the farm. I never did like the farm, and they would say how great it was being in Washington, D.C., New York. They call it the promised land, but I find out not the promised land really, but it's what you make of it. And then I happened to walk to McDougal's store one day, and this white man was talking to a group of people. He said, if you're ever in Washington, stop by to see him. He was telling the white folks that.
You were talking about Senator Burnett Maybank.
Burnett Maybank. Now I know Senator Burnett Maybank. Then I didn't know who he was. I just know he was a white gentleman there with a lot of shiny cars and chauffeurs. I grabbed him before he could close the door. And I said, if I ever come to Washington, can I stop by to see you? He said, yes.
And you did.
And I did.
And you did. Well, the story just boggles the mind that, you know, you'd never been off the farm. You'd never seen an indoor toilet, for example. You'd never been anywhere by yourself. And at 13 years old, you somehow get yourself up there. And then, not only that, you actually go see the man in the Senate. And he gives you a job.
Well, I guess it was a blessing that I lost my cousin's address, because once I slept a couple of nights in the Union Station, I tried to ask cab drivers out front, did they know my cousin? They kind of look at me and laugh, where are you from? Boy, you from the country or something like that. I didn't know the difference between being in Washington, D.C. and being in South Carolina, because everybody knows everybody. And I look up and I saw the Capitol, and then I thought about Maybank, and then that's when I took off to the Capitol.
And he gives you a job, you know, sweeping the steps, and you later find out he's actually paying you out of his own pocket.
He was paying me out of his own pocket, and then later he called me in and said, I'm going to give you a real job, and I thought I had a real job.
You write very evocatively, though, about life in the Senate, because you were such a hard worker. You were always looking sort of pitch in, so you get jobs in the Senate barbershop and in the Senate bath, and at some point you become part of kind of the permanent staff, and you called yourselves the Invisibles. Why did you all call yourselves the Invisibles?
Well, I use the word invisible because of the way the senators discuss things around the downstairs crew. You would think it was the only one in the room the way they would talk before us. And we learned a lot. And Mickey had told me when I started sweeping the steps, whatever you hear, you leave it there.
Mickey was your supervisor when you first got to the
first started sweeping
set
the
you
steps.
sweeping the steps, and
Yes.
you did and looked out for you.
Yeah.
But you know, one of the reasons that this whole section and this whole book was so compelling to me is I think anybody who's worked in Washington is that, you know, there's this whole world of the monuments and the beautiful marble buildings, but then there's a whole other world of people who are making it work and look beautiful that, as you pointed out, like nobody ever thinks about, that people don't think about. And to this day, most of the people making all that work and happen are African American. But you also talk about the fact that you formed close relationships with a couple of really powerful people. And I'll just ask you about that. You know, one of them, of course, is Senator Strom Thurmond, a fellow South Carolinian, staunch segregationist, ran for president on the third-party ticket, the Dixiecrat Party. But you all describe yourselves as friends. Do you think you were friends? Is that really, do you think he would say you were friends?
If I can take a few seconds to say
Sure.
that there were many celebrities, if you want to call them that, many senators, many foreign ministers, Secretary of State I met. It was just not only Thurmond and Helms and all that. But Thurmond and I became friends because of Maybank.
You think he would use that word too?
I don't know. We never did discuss the situation about how blacks were being treated. I guess now I can realize I had my agenda and they had their agenda.
You know, people will remember that when he ran for president on the Dixiecrat Party, he had this to say about segregation. He said, there's not enough troops in the Army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the, we'll insert the word Negro here, race, into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. But you also write that the word went out that if black folks needed something, they would go to him, and he would help them out.
After I met him, when I first met him, I told him that I worked for Senator Maybank. He said, okay, you are my constituent. He said, if you ever need any help or any of your folks need any help or anybody need any help, come and let me know.
And he would help them out.
And he helped them out.
And in fact,
black, blue, brown, or white, Republican, Democrat, whatever you may have been.
And you had a personal experience with this when you wanted to go to Howard University, one of the venerable institutions of higher learning in Washington, D.C., and they said your grades weren't good enough, which you can understand since you ran away at 13, and he did what?
Well, if I may include, I went to American University also.
Okay, well.
There wasn't no problem there when I entered American University.
Okay,
So
duly
when I
noted.
decided I was majoring in American government, so after a while he said, "Bertie, what happened? You didn't. You say you were going to school." I said, "Well, I applied to Howard University, and they were saying I needed some remedial courses or something to enter Howard." He said, "What?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I've been waiting for a while." So he got on the phone. I don't know if he was talking to anyone or not, but he got on the phone. He said, "Bob, I have a young man down here," and believe it or not, he said he didn't say boy, he said a young man that tried to get in your school and you would not take him in. And he said, "Bob, don't you know 80% of your funds come from the government?" He said, "I'm going to send him back up there." And it goes from there that I was accepted in Howard University within a week.
Well, there you go.
Because of what Thurman said.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Tell Me More from NPR News. We're speaking to the author of Step by Step, a memoir of living the American dream, Bertie Bowman. Talk to me, if you would, though. There are two different presidents that you talk about vividly in the book, two people who became president, and the first was LBJ. He was quite popular with the downstairs staff, as you say. Why was that?
Johnson knew how blacks were treated from the get-go. And Johnson, he would give you the shirt off of his back, too, and curse you out, too, if he had to. When he come to the barbershop, the Page boys who was in the barbershop, the other senators who were in there talking or something like that, they would put one at the door to let them know when Johnson, because they were talking about him like a dog. And that's what I heard, I'm telling you the truth. And that when they let him know when Johnson come in, everyone act like, oh, they lovey-dovey, you know. And Johnson would come in, he said, "I know you're talking about me, you know, but if you try to put something in a bill that shouldn't go there, you can kiss your seat goodbye."
He was all about it.
He was all about it.
Then there was that young 21-year-old white guy named Bill, who you met when he worked as a messenger in the Senate, and you were his supervisor. And it turns out that that young guy became the 42nd president of the United States, Bill Clinton. Will you tell us a little bit about your friendship with Mr. Clinton?
We became friends. He was singing. He liked Blue Suede Shoes, and I liked some other song we had. But we used to get back. He played the saxophone. I used to pretend I'm playing a guitar. I never did learn how to play my guitar, but I was imitate, you know.
And why did people like him? You said he was also very popular with the staff. Why was that?
He was another personal guy who kind of grew up with blacks and knew the things that they went through, knew how they suffer and stuff like that. It didn't matter to him. He wanted everybody to be treated fair. We discussed that a lot. But one thing that Bill Clinton and I never did discuss, that him being president. We discussed that he would be Attorney General. We would discuss that he would be the governor. That's what we discussed. But then all of a sudden, things started happening, you know, and he gave it a try because everybody else was scared to run for the 41st President Bush.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill decided to do it, and Ross Perot came in there and made sure that Bill won.
You do follow things, right? You know all about it, right?
Let's get to Senator Helms. You didn't ask me about Senator Helms, but let me say.
Yeah, tell me about Senator Helms.
Senator Helms often say when he came up to the Senate, he said, "Oh, I heard about you. Storm would talk about you." See, Senator Storm had talked to Helms because they were very good friends.
But, you know, here again, here's somebody who, you know, filibustered the, civil rights bills, filibustered the Martin Luther King holiday, held up the creation of the Museum of African American History and Culture, which only now has had ground broken on the wall. And yet, you consider him a friend?
I consider him a friend. Like I say, he had his agenda and I had mine. My agenda were to try to make sure that I survive, help other people if I can. He called me Bud, and why he called me Bud, I don't know, and I never questioned it. And
but he never called you boy or anything.
He never called, but Bud could be for boy, but he never called me boy. But so he brought me back to work after being in retirement for near 10 years, because he often said he would make me the head coordinator of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
And you're still hearing coordinator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
I'm still a hearing coordinator, meet and greet, take care of all of the foreign policy stuff.
Well, what do you think your life means, Mr. Bertie Bowman? I mean, when you look at the sort of the arc of your life, running away from home at 13, and folks can't see you, but you're quite elegantly attired. You have a beautiful foreign hand. You've got one of your service pins. You've got three for your long-standing service. And what do you think your life means? What do you think it should stand for? What do you want people to draw from your story?
Well, I want them to draw from my story that, number one, tell your grandkids, stay in school. Get that education. That's number one. You know, a lot of kids out here, especially the black kids, they can survive and be a good person, a celebrity, a rich person without getting a college degree. But I still say stay in school and get the education.
Bertie Bowman is the author of Step by Step, a memoir of living the American dream. And at the age of 81, he's still serving as the hearing coordinator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he joined us in our Washington, D.C. studios. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure that you invited me down. I really appreciate the interview.
Switching gears now, this year to observe Black History Month, we have been digging into memoirs. And as we've said, the tradition of African-American memoir dates back to slavery, when formerly enslaved people somehow found a way to set down the stories of what they had endured. But now we notice that there seems to be a fresh urgency among African-Americans to tell their stories. So every week this month, we've talked to the author of a recent memoir. But today, as Black History Month winds down, we have two essayists who have taken on the interesting question of what it means to be Black and cool. Helena Andrews and Margot Jefferson were among those who contributed essays for a new collection called Black Cool, 1,000 Streams of Blackness. It was edited by the author and activist Rebecca Walker. She created what she envisioned as a periodic table of Black cool, element by element. But we'll let these two ladies tell us what's cool. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Helena, I'm going to go to you first. Your essay is called Reserve, and I wanted to ask what inspired you to write this essay besides whatever Rebecca Walker says to do, you do.
Exactly. Rebecca sends you an email and you answer her immediately. The funniest thing is that I ignored Rebecca's emails for about 6 months because she'd been working on this project forever, and I sent her a graph. She said, I'm working on Black Cool. Tell me everything you can about Black Cool, basically. And I sent her an email. I sent her this graph just from my perspective. It's like, I feel like Black women, obviously I'm a Black woman, so I come from that perspective. And I said, I think Black women have this mask, just this superhero quality about us where we're not necessarily interfacing with the outside world always. Sometimes we're kind of removed for it, and obviously that's a protective mechanism, but other people perceive it to be this coolness that we have. And then a couple months later, Rebecca said, okay, you're going to do Reserve. And I was like, perfect. And at the time I was in Italy, I think. And
that's cool.
That was cool. And I was in Italy, and then I also went to Morocco. And there was just this, for me, being a tourist, being this Black woman in those different spaces, I could see myself putting on that mask, that cool mask. And Reserve it was perfect.
I'm just going to read a short quote from the essay. It is the steely look of detachment the outside world gets when they call to us from the corner, hey, short, hey, or in the club, excuse me, miss, or into an office. This is our coolness coat of arms, our impenetrable shield. And I'm editing a little bit just for time, but you say what some call, and I'm going to use the word B word, what some call the B word face, I call the survival side eye.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit.
I think like I said before, I think it's definitely a protective mechanism that we pull on. But I don't necessarily think it's a learned behavior. That's when we talk about Black cool. We're talking about these parts of us as Black people that aren't taught, if anything, handed down from generation to generation. But it's not a learned behavior, something that, a white kid's going to do. It's something that I just almost did automatically, putting on this mask when you go outside in order to protect yourself, in order to feel as if you are keeping part of you for yourself. And the outside world gets something different. I think that Black women do that in a really unique way.
Margot Jefferson, your essay is called Eccentricity, and it's a very interesting meditation on language, among other things. What inspired you?
Well, I've always been very intrigued by my own mixed reactions to the kind of eccentricities, the extremities of Black language. The way we will make up new names constantly, combined from fragments of old names, movie stars, play heroes, etc., or make up new verbs. Or just the way we dress in these wild, often outrageous ways. But my feelings and the feelings of many Black people are mixed. We're impressed, but we also have this tradition of, oh my God, there we are with our loud colors again, or oh no, those loud sandals. And that's what I wanted to get at, those mixed emotions, and also that the ways in which we have been culturally punished, meaning demeaned, diminished, and rewarded.
for these extremes of style.
We're talking about Black Cool with two ladies who have written their own chapters on the definition of cool. Writers Margot Jefferson, that's who was speaking just now, and Helena Andrews have both contributed essays to the new collection Black Cool, 1,000 Streams of Blackness. It's part of our Black History Month celebration where we're digging into memoir. So, Margot, if I could just read a little bit from your essay about the kind of the duality you're talking about. You write, on the one hand, we are all proud of our people's contribution to the English language, their centuries of vernacular resourcefulness. But on the other hand, you also talk about how this is very funny to me. It takes a minute to read. An important legacy of that essay is this: we must constantly, continually reassess the forms Negro eccentricity takes. Plenty of these forms are sanctioned now thanks to generations of artists and scholars who were resourceful and committed enough to know how easily eccentricity can be seen as ignorance and vulgarity, a course of acute social embarrassment. And like any form developing in the moment, working at the ground level of culture, it experiments wantonly and makes what each of us considers big mistakes. And you have in parentheses, young Negro men in pants hanging significantly below their butts, big mistake.
I also want to add that I chose to use the word Negro because it's at this point an eccentric word, but I still think a cool word. It changes according to situation, motivation, circumstance all the time.
Helena Andrews, I want to come back to you because you also talk about this is not an unmitigated good, this ability to wear a mask, because you said a mask can limit and imprison as much as it can liberate and empower. I wanted to ask you about that, and if you don't mind, I'd also like to ask, you feel like you've gotten over that mask and you can put it on and take it off when it suits you?
I think so. I mean, when you have this wall built up, obviously it's protective, right? You're building it up in order to protect yourself and be safe, but at the same time, now people can't get in. People can't see the real you. Can you even see the real you, right? Because there's no mirror now. And I think in exploring that, especially exploring in my own life, I wrote about it in my memoir. I had a sorority sister who ended up committing suicide, and none of us knew. None of us knew where she was, and a lot of people would say that, or it's obviously many times like a surprise, but
you had no idea she was suffering.
No, not at all. You know what I mean? Because I feel part of it was this mask that she put up around us, and because we couldn't see who she truly was, even though we thought we knew her so well. You know what I mean? So I felt like there's a duality there. It can protect you, but it can also definitely imprison you. So we have to teach, especially our young girls, yes, sometimes when you're walking down the street, you have to know, you got to have that stank fist on sometimes when you're walking down U Street or, 125th or wherever you are. But at the same time, you have to know when to put that away, and you have to know when to really check in with yourself and be your authentic self. There has to be a space for you to feel safe to be authentic.
Margot, final thought from you. What?
I completely agree with all of that. What's so good now is that, the impenetrable masks of how we examine and critique ourselves as a people, that's slipping. We have so much more room than the old duality of celebration or denigration. And I'm really thrilled about that.
I started with a question, though, Margot. Is it that, and forgive me, but are Black people inherently cool, or do they have to work at it, in your view? I mean, part of this book is an exploration of the various ways of identity and ways of being that are now permitted of African Americans. But I wonder, I know it's a terrible question to ask, but do you think Black people are inherently cool, or do they have to work at it?
We want to believe we are. The effect of cool is to make the observer believe it's inherent. I don't believe any real cool is achieved without some kind of work. It's about technique.
Pulitzer Prize winner. Now that is cool. Margot Jefferson is a New York-based cultural critic. She's author of On Michael Jackson. She's also written and performed 2 theater pieces. That's also cool. And she teaches writing, and she's also working on another book. She was with us from our bureau in New York. Thank you, Margot.
Thank you.
Helena Andrews is a writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Her memoir, and I'm using a euphemism here, B-Word is the New Black, is now available in paperback, and there is a film version in the work. Now, that's pretty cool, too. And Helena Andrews was here with us in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Wasn't that a treat? I'm telling you, we have a whole bunch of good stuff. Information, entertainment. We had a tutorial on the meaning of the word memoir and the increasing number of African Americans who are expressing themselves in this new genre. I would encourage you, those of you that want to hear more like this, to check out Tell Me More on NPR on their playlist. I think it would be remiss of me to close out this week without acknowledging that February is also the month of love. It's Valentine's Day. Every February 14th, across the United States and in other places around the world, candy, flowers, and gifts are exchanged between loved ones, all in the name of Saint Valentine's. But who is this mysterious saint, and where did these traditions come from? Well, the history of Valentine's Day and the story of its patron saint is shrouded in mystery. We do know that February has been celebrated as a month of romance, and that St. Valentine's Day, as we know it today, contains vestiges of both Christian and ancient Roman tradition. Did you know approximately 150 million Valentine's Day cards are exchanged annually? Yeah. 17.9 billion is the total amount that will be spent on Valentine's Day gifts. But let's flip the switch. I found two lovely poems from children on Valentine's Day to their parents. And the first one is called Because They Love Me by Jenna Fowler. And it reads, when I'm sad, they comfort me. When I'm sick, they care for me. When I misbehave, they discipline me. Because they love me. When I need help, they help me. When I lose all faith, they help me regain it. When I need forgiveness, they forgive me. Because they love me. When I'm cold, they give me shelter. When I need help with my homework, they help me the best they can. When I'm lost, they come and find me. Because they love me. When I feel dumb, they let me know I'm smart. And when I made fun of, they tell me I'm special. No matter what happens, I know they will always be there. Because they love me. A second one is Give Her a Day by Liza Martin. What can you give to one small girl? A diamond ring, a baton or a twirl, a pretty pink dress with lots of bows, a dainty sandals that shows her toes, a walk in the woods, a romp in the park, a shopping trip from dusk till dark, a shiny new bike. No, there's still time for such things yet. Give her a day of her very own. Just one small girl and her dad alone. Give her the gift that only you can. The companionship of her old man. Games are outgrown and toys decay, but she'll never forget you gave her a day. And I gave you this hour. I look forward to our next time. Your seat is guaranteed. I love you.